Hi, welcome to another episode of my combined vlog and podcast series. My name is Mark Deuze. I'm a professor of media studies at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And in this series, I'm interviewing media scholars from around the world, people whose work I use in my teaching and in my research that I'm a fan of. And today I'm really privileged to be sitting down with Feona Attwood and Belinda Middleweek. And Feona and Belinda are two scholars in the field of research on media and sex and sexualities. Their work is truly transdisciplinary. It addresses all kinds of different issues related to sex and sexuality, ranging from technosexualities and digital intimacies to sex in film, to sexting, and to porn and beyond. So I'm really excited to be talking with them. First of all, with Feona Attwood, who's currently a visiting professor at Northumbria University, where I'm a visiting professor as well. In the United Kingdom. She's known for developing the study of pornographies and for her contribution to all kinds of debates on sexualities and culture. She's been co-editor of the leading critical sexuality studies journal. And in 2014, she was one of the founders of the first academic journal on porn studies. She published in 2017 the seminal book Sex Media with Polity Press. In the same year, she co-edited the Routledge Companion to Media, Sex and Sexuality. And she was also co-author of the more recent volume on objectification, on the difference between sex and sexism. Belinda Middleweek is a senior lecturer in journalism at the School of Communications at the University of Technology in Sydney, where I am also a visiting professor. It's a small world. She's worked as a news producer for the leading breakfast television shows in Australia. She has a background as an associate producer and field producer and researcher on investigative crime documentaries. Her research looks at the implications of media technologies, of emerging trends in journalism, and on transdisciplinary approaches to human, machine, and human tech relationships and interactions. She's a member of the UTS Expert Working Group on Human Rights and Artificial Intelligence. Co-authored the book a couple of years ago with Oxford University Press, Real Sex Films, on the new intimacy and risk in cinema, together with John Tulloch. And her latest book is titled Feral Media. It's a book on the Chamberlain case 40 years on, published by Australian Scholarly Press. Belinda has held visiting professorships in different parts of the world at City University in London, at the Danish School of Media and Journalism, as well as the University of California's Berkeley Center for New Media. And with Belinda and Fiona, we talk about the complexity of talking about and studying sex and sexuality in media, the position of sex, porn, and sexuality studies in the wider field of media and communication research. We talk about some of the paradoxes that you find when you start researching sex media between, for example, on the one hand, living in an age of sexual plenty when it comes to media, the amount of information and opportunities we have for us to explore ourselves and our sexual identities in media, and on the other hand, the sort of simultaneous rationalization of sex and sexuality, the clampdown on people's rights for exploration, the increasing intrusion of our privacy through surveillance, and so on and so forth. We end our discussion today on what lies ahead now that sex and love and all these other experiences that are so fundamental to the human condition are becoming more an object of study, getting more put into the limelight, and thereby also forcing us to develop more nuanced and complex understandings of them. And where do we go from there? So I'm really excited about this conversation. I hope you are too. I warmly encourage you to share, like, forward our conversation. Use it in your teaching if you're a teacher, and of course, please check out all the other interviews in this series of interviews with fabulous media scholars. Today, Feona Attwood and Belinda Middleweek. Hello, Feona. Hello, Belinda. Really good to see both of you. What I honestly didn't realize when we set all of this up and when I was preparing is that we're all colleagues now. This is crazy. It's like, I mean, Belinda, you're at UTS, and where I have a visiting professorship, which has never materialized thanks to the pandemic. And also thanks to the pandemic, I now have a visiting professorship at Northumbria, where Feona, you are as well as a visiting professor. But I don't know about you, but I haven't been to Newcastle, even though it's around the corner yet.
Really?
Have you, or?
Well, not in the last year, but it's a part of the country I know really well because my family are from up there. So we will have to meet.
Yes, absolutely. And not just this way, but it is truly a privilege to meet both of you this way. Belinda in Sydney, and Feona, you're in the south of England at the moment, and me in the northeast. Look, we're going to talk about sex, sexualities, media in the broadest possible sense of the terms. And I would love to get us started with talking a little bit about, our job or our task or our responsibility, if we want to make it really heavy, as scholars of sex, sexuality, and media, which, I mean, I wouldn't call myself one. I'm writing a book on love at the moment, but so sex does factor in that to some extent, I guess. But because, I mean, on the one hand, I mean, all of this takes place in the context of the ever-increasing mediatization of everyday life. And obviously, sex and sexuality and sexual identity forms an intricate part of all of that. And you, in your work, you make this point that and Feona, in sex media, for example, you make this beautiful argument that sex education should be tied in with digital literacy because we use media so much to explore, to find out, and to express our sexual identities. And so you would think that, well, if this is such a big deal, and obviously we live in the age of Me Too, of constant Twitter storms about what celebrities like J.K. Rowling have said about people's sexuality or didn't say about it, and obviously we all take to the media and are awash in an abundance of sexual information and imagery and ideas. You would imagine that professions such as journalism would take that seriously and help us navigate this space. But your research, Belinda, on sex journalism shows that, it's considered to be a lightweight topic, that it's often not taken seriously at all, and that sex journalists really struggle to sort of get this position in the profession. So considering all of this, what is our role as scholars in helping people to figure this whole discussion about sex and sexuality and media out, to be, on the one hand, positive and nuanced, as you both are in your work about sex and sexuality, and on the other hand, still remain critical about all these discussions. I mean, it's a very complex space. I know I'm rambling at the moment with my question, but I'm just wondering how you embody that kind of role as a sex researcher in this context. Fiona, may I ask you to kick us off?
Well, I think it's really, really hard because, first of all, I think journalists really like stories that are sensationalist and attention grabbing, and they like that kind of research. So that, there's a study that's come out in the UK recently that's got lots and lots of press attention, which is all about analysing the titles of porn videos. And it's a really bad piece of work, but it's been in the Times, it was funded by Leverhulme, it's been reported everywhere as a landmark study. And I think that all of the kind of the many, many nuanced, rigorous, thoughtful pieces of work that are there now, would never get that kind of airspace. So it's really hard that even though even where the scholarship does exist, it's very hard for that to find a space to become visible. And I mean, the other side of it is that I don't think universities, by and large, like academics doing work, to be respectable as a sex researcher, you really have to be taking that line that sex is a problem or sex is dangerous. And then you can kind of occupy a space where institutions will get behind you. So that isn't an answer at all to the question what we can do, but I think it my experience has been, even when people try their hardest and even when the work is there, you don't have the support really of either academic establishments or the mainstream press to showcase that work. So it's a bit of a conundrum, that how do you get through without stepping back into that space of shouting, it's all really dangerous, in which case people will then start listening to you.
Do you feel that way as well, Belinda? I remember you also sort of expressing on the one hand, like you want to do research and take sex seriously. I mean, you do research on people's relationships with sex robots, for example. You've published work on sex journalism, like wonderful work. I mean, you've taken that work around the world, but at the same time, like, where do you fit in? I mean, I remember us having conversations about that as an academic. And on the other hand, how to get your message across outside of academia. Do you have that same kind of tug of war that Feona illustrates?
Oh, absolutely. I was just cheering in the background there as Fiona was talking, because it's just astonishing to me that that journalism scholarship is really dropping the ball when it comes to covering issues to do with sex. And I even find it amongst colleagues, so within academe, that I tell colleagues about the kind of research that I'm doing, that it's about sex journalism, and they'll say to me, well, what is sex journalism? That doesn't really exist. That's not really journalism. And it's essentially an assessment and an evaluation of quality and of taste. And that's what I have a problem with. And similarly, I think, so much sex reportage is seen as sensationalist and titillating and dramatized, and it really is, as Fiona said, a lowly and discredited form of news work. And I think part of the problem has to do with this binary thinking about what constitutes good and bad journalism. And an historical legacy of seeing sex as being part of soft news and very gendered and associated with women, and then devalued as a result. So I guess I wonder, to solve the problem, what do we need to do to come back to your question? What can we do as scholars? And I think part of what we can do is to talk more about sex in media and to address its taboo status. That would be really one thing. And to keep challenging that binary thinking, and prudishness too. I think that there's a prevailing prudishness about sex, and that shapes public opinion about representations of sex. And to question the notion that there are certain forms of media that are inherently male and female. Obviously, that's a problem. And I guess we need more and better critical frameworks for understanding the role of sex in media. So I guess they're just some of the things that I would advocate, or indeed what I'm trying to do in my own research.
Fiona, your book Sex Media with Polity Press, was that an attempt, or can we see it's framed as an attempt to address this very issue in a way? I mean, to open up the conversation, to show all the different ways in which we can actually think and talk about sex. Because one thing in the book, the point that you make in the book is the link between thinking and talking about sex and digital literacy.
Yeah.
That digital literacy should include that component, which I found really, really fascinating.
It was an attempt to try to, and it was a challenge that I set myself as well, because I have never been taught to write in an accessible way or for different audiences, and I wanted to try and write something accessible, but that didn't oversimplify those ideas. And when I started to put the book together, it did make it very clear to me that we do think about all those issues as if they're totally separate. So this history of regulation, which we don't then set aside questions of taste and genre and aesthetics, and then we don't set that aside a history of sexual politics and gender politics, and then we don't think about that in relation to literacy and sex education. They're all massively connected,
right?
But for some reason, they're often treated as if they're entirely separate. So yes, I suppose it is partly, as Belinda says, it's a question of trying to reframe the way things are presented, so that sex isn't always playing this particular role of being titillating or scary or being held up for ridicule or being funny, because that's the other thing. This is just a silly topic, something we can all laugh about. I think the other issue is there is a lot of interest out there. If you do kind of public talks, and if you talk to people who work with young people, teachers and health professionals and so on, they are much more open-minded, I think, than academic institutions or the mainstream press. So there are audiences for this kind of research and these kinds of ideas. And so maybe it is about trying to refocus efforts a bit about who we're speaking to. I don't know, but I mean, certainly I don't, that idea that we are going to go to the broadsheet press with our research and that they will present that in a helpful way is maybe just banging your head against a brick wall, and perhaps it's about a change of stance or strategy.
Yeah, it's funny. It's so in the research I'm doing right now for so I have this crazy idea in my head that I want to write a book about love and media, but I see a similar debate that a lot of scholars of love in different disciplines. I don't know if you probably know this. For me this was news that there is actually a field of love studies.
Oh no, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it started by mostly feminist media scholars, and in 2014, around the same time, I think that's when Porn Studies, the journal, started, right? That you found it, yeah. So there's an interesting corollary there, and they similarly talk about how when they present their work at conferences or for colleagues, like at brown bags, and those kind of things, that people are almost like uncomfortable and they're kind of skittish. And exactly what you say, Fiona, they either laugh, or like you say, Belinda, they turn it into a discussion about quality or status. One thing that comes out of that literature that I'm just going to throw that out there, see how you respond to that, is to say, well, what we find interesting about studying love is to look at it as a source of power. And from a very small scale to talk about love as a source of power for example, women in abusive or oppressive relationships. But on a larger scale, love as a transformative power, that if we want to do anything to solve the problems of the world today, I mean, we need love, right? We don't need nationalities. We don't need, the EU. We need love, which I mean, it sounds naive, but I find it a really inspiring argument. And by going to that, what is most intimate for people, you actually tap into also that what is the most powerful in order for people to do anything. But I would imagine that sex and sexuality is right up there. Is there a corollary to this argument in your work or in the research that you use for your work? I'm asking both of you, so I don't know what you.
I think the thing that's leapt out there from what you just said is that word intimacies, and I know there's been a shift. I mean, there's several projects at the moment, research projects happening around digital intimacies,
Right?
And maybe that is one of those key shifts to try to stop thinking about these things as sex is over here and it's funny, and love is over here but it's a bit girly. But you know, what are the importances of those? Because they're central to our lives, aren't they? Connections with other people. And maybe that's the part of the reframing that needs to happen conceptually. But maybe that's also part of the reframing that helps us explain its significance to other people. Is it? I don't know. That because everybody's concerned about their intimate lives, aren't they? Even if they don't use that term.
I mean, that's kind of, is it, am I right, Belinda, that that's kind of what you're trying to do in your research, for example, on sex robot relationships, and how, I mean, your study of how people in an online forum discuss their relationship with their sex doll, or about those kind of relationships at all, that you find that are actually quite nuanced and complex, rather than, you know, silly or funny or incredibly sexist or whatever. I mean, I found that work really illuminating and showing that complexity of what Feona talks about, the digital intimacy.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, what I found so fascinating was the fact that these principally men talking in, say, the doll forum, for instance, were connecting to one another through the medium of, through media, but through the medium of sex dolls. By talking about their sex dolls, they were actually forming these homosocial bonds with one another, and connecting with one another was actually more important than the sex dolls themselves. I mean, they had these long and ponderous descriptions of their relationships with their sex dolls, and they would post photographs of their sex dolls. They would talk about a technological future with sex robots. But I just found so fascinating the fact that they were connecting with one another. And that was what seemed to be most important, was building these relationships with one another. Which is about, you know, speaks back to your point about intimacy and how intimate our media is.
Is that for both of you? I mean, this notion of that, what at the heart of these discussions is the power of connection and our need to connect and to be connected. And because both of you talk in different ways in your work about I love the alliteration, the political potential of performativity in all of this, right? Like by expressing ourselves, by collecting images and ideas about sex and sexuality through media, by talking about it, by acting out. There's a performative element in all of this, and of course that means it's an element that is about connecting to others, like showing off to others or expressing yourself vis-a-vis others. That there's real political potential in those acts, perhaps to challenge patriarchy or to address recurring moral panics about sex and media. Can you talk a little bit more about this potential of performativity of sex and media? I mean, that seems there's real agency there. You suggest.
I think in the I mean for me, one of the things that was really striking about what I early forms of cybersex, which was very sort of basic and sort of text-based, it still strikes me as like totally radical that people would have sex by typing, because that completely explodes the idea of what you think or what we're supposed to think sex is. And, you know, that it's about bodies, it's physical, it involves contact, it doesn't have anything to do with words particularly. So, and that's something that was like massively accessible, used by lots of people, became very sort of a mundane part of lots of people's lives, but does this like incredible challenging challenging to ideas about what things are supposed to be and what they're supposed to mean. So I think even just on that level, there's a huge political potential there. And then I think more recently, the thing that with the project on porn audiences that I was involved in with Clarissa Smith and Martin Barker, it became really evident that especially young people were engaging with online porn. And partly that was about reaching out to others and connecting to others, but it was also a very sort of self-reflective thing. Like, am I this kind of person? Do I like this kind of thing? What if I was in that kind of scenario? They were kind of like provided little spaces where you know, and can you work out from your reactions to types of pornography, am I bisexual? Might I be trans? Could I think of myself as queer? Can I imagine having this kind of relationship with another person? So they're about connection, they're about playing with ideas of sex and gender, but they're also little stages where people can become themselves, grow into themselves, try on different personas. And I think those things are challenging on the kind of everyday small p political scheme of things. But they also lead people, I think, to question those bigger systems of power and the status quo and received wisdom about what things mean, how women behave, what sex means, who can do what with who, and they just seem to provide spaces that people, well, some people really take the opportunity to make use of them for all sorts of interesting purposes.
Oh yeah, the moment you start questioning that kind of received wisdom, all hell breaks loose, of course. If that is, I mean, that's real power there. I mean, Belinda, how does that work for you and in your perspective?
Oh, look, Fiona mentioned the body, and I just find it so fascinating that in all the research that I do, whether it's about you know, sex doll communities, or whether it's sex worker selfies, or the research that I did with John Tulloch about real sex films, it's this concept of embodiment that keeps coming back, and the political potential of performativity through embodiment, through, you know, bringing the body back into an online environment. So I'm really interested in the way that marginalized communities, and marginalized because of their sexual behaviors or sexual preferences or sexual identities, the way in which those communities make the body visible online, and what role that plays in being a political act, or what role the body plays as an instrument of political expression, I guess. So I find that really quite interesting. And I was looking, one study that I did that was based on the hashtag Faces of Prostitution, and it was about a bunch of sex workers around the world who were posting selfies. And it was just really interesting to see how those selfies were so important as a tool of political protest for those sex workers, and that it enabled them to start petitioning for the rights of sex workers and to argue for the decriminalisation of sex work. So in that sense, I guess I see the body is so central to these conversations about performance and about politics in online spaces.
I remember, I mean, didn't Faces of Prostitution start as a hashtag in Australia? Like a young woman posted a picture of herself in response to like a really denigrating comment by an Australian male politician, if I'm not mistaken. And then the shocking part of that was that sex workers became visible, exactly what you say. So, like that we saw their bodies, right? I mean, and proudly so. I mean, maybe a little bit of context. Was that because it became a global phenomenon? But was there something particular Australian about that moment?
Look, from memory, this was several years ago, but it was, one particular, a young sex worker who took exception to what she saw in an advertisement, I think it was, about the conflation of sex trafficking with sex work. And so she posted a selfie and said, "This is the real face of prostitution." And then that started the hashtag Faces of Prostitution. But it was so fascinating because it was an opportunity for principally female sex workers to take control of the conversation around their bodies. So often it's everybody else moralizing about sex work, about sex workers' bodies. But through that selfie protest, they were able to say, no, this is my body, this is how I use my body. And in very, not necessarily sexualized poses, everyday kind of poses of, you know, here's me tying up my shoelaces before I go out for my morning run sort of thing.
Yeah.
And here's me with my 2 kids getting ready for work. I mean, it was a wonderful expression of the power of selfies and collectivity. And I think that they found a new way of protesting, of reaching out for a constituency, an international constituency, through that hashtag.
Now, when we talk about sex and media, sex, sexuality and media, I mean, and this example of the, you know, of hashtag activism, if you will, I mean, and there's so many, right? I mean, Face of Prostitution, then we had Distractingly Sexy, worldwide, like female scientists showing pictures of themselves at work, and I can do this without making anybody fall in love with me or wanting to have sex with me, as in response to a Nobel Prize winner's silly comments about that. And of course, Me Too. I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, look, I mean, we live in a media culture where information, imagery, ideas about sexuality are abundant. They're everywhere, both critical as well as celebratory. I mean, both in terms of having fun and exploring, as well as, you know, clamping down on misogyny and on abuse and those kind of things. I mean, so you could argue that this is fantastic, right? We live in an incredibly rich age when it comes to exploring sex and sexuality and sexual identity. And both of you have done research to articulate this. I mean, like you mentioned the book Real Sex Films, Belinda, that you did with John Tulloch, where you link this emerging genre in contemporary film with changing notions of coupling and relational commitment, and really show how this is part of a much broader conversation society has with itself. I mean, so fabulous. On the other hand, and that's kind of a paradox I see also in your work, that I'm projecting onto your work, there is also a sort of and as a sociologist, you would say, like a simultaneous clamping down on all of this. I mean, on the one hand, policymakers and regulators all over the world sort of acting and reacting to this, opting for more intense surveillance of citizens, more intrusions to our privacy. And beyond all of that, survey after survey shows around the world that young people are delaying being sexually active, which some researchers, often not media scholars, mind, but put the blame on media for, right? It's like the very fact that we have an abundant sex media is the cause that young people are not having sex anymore. And some people don't want them to have sex, and other people are worried that they don't have sex. It's very confusing. So how do we resolve this tension between, on the one, sex and sexuality being this sort of positive explosion of variety and diversity and complexity on the one hand, and this sort of rationalization of sex media on the other hand that seems to be going on as well? Who wants to dive in? Belinda, please.
Oh, I actually, yeah, this is a tough one. I mean, my first thought is, can we resolve the tension? I'm not sure. I think we need to have nuanced and balanced discussion about sex media, and that would be a good start, and moving away from the moralizing discourse and that binary thinking about good and bad sex, good and bad media, all that sort of thing, and looking and maybe it's a case, and I'm borrowing terms from psychology here, but maybe it's a case of looking at what is helpful and unhelpful in terms of media engagements, or in terms of I don't know, sexual behaviors and practices. But I do have a problem with this binary thinking, because I think there are so many value judgments that are intertwined there. What do you think, Fiona? It's a tough one.
I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? That I think to go back to what we were talking about earlier, it's kind of proof that these issues are really political, aren't they? Because, you know, if you look at the particularly kind of younger people over the last 10 years, maybe, the way that younger people seem to have a very different view of what gender identity means and how they're going to identify themselves in terms of gender and sexuality is a real radical shift. Perhaps it's not surprising that the powers that be want to keep a lid on that. You know, it's that's in a way that's nothing new, because it is a challenge to the system, and it's a lot of that is about the right kind of sex or the right way of being male or female. So in a way, I think it's not surprising that there's that kind of counter movement to put the lid on it, to stop it happening. It's not dissimilar from, you know, the trials of D.H. Lawrence's books, and, you know, would you want your wife and servants to read this kind of thing? It's the fact that it's the sexual minorities and young people and women who are saying, well, we think we want to do things differently, or we don't see it like that, you know, that seems to provoke that reaction. I think the other thing, though, is that there's often something else going on in that move to regulate. You know, it's a really handy weapon to argue for more general regulation, isn't it? Sort of let's tighten up legislation, let's put people in prison, let's criminalize people, let's restrict access to the internet, because we can do it in the name of like protecting people from sexual perverts, or stopping children finding things out that they might find disturbing, and so on. So I think often it becomes, it's a kind of handy, it's a handy set of things to accomplish other political goals that governments have. They can, you know, gain more control over more things by playing the sex card. So sometimes it's not about the sex, sometimes it's about here's a way we can do what we want to do, I think.
What have you found in your work, or when you look at this sort of this field of research? I mean, we have dedicated journals, of course. I mean, Fiona, your career-long involvement with the Sexualities Journal, I mean, a benchmark journal in this field. You co-founded the journal Porn Studies. There's a real rich literature here now that both of you are such an important part of. That how does that literature help us to sort of do two things at the same time? On the one hand, exactly what you're saying, Fiona, is to you know, when everybody's talking about sex, what is actually happening, right? What is behind that discussion? But secondly, when sex is the discussion, how it is a different discussion for different kinds of people, like where you live, whether you're male or female, or anything else, what kind of sexual preference or sexual activity you do or you feel you belong to. I mean, religion, I mean, all of that really shapes to what extent we are looking for, are able to participate in any kind of discussion regarding sex and sexuality, especially, of course, in the media. How do you feel the field is able to, or what has it provide? How does it provide us with the tools needed to unpack those really complicated issues? Because I guess one of the reasons why sex and media have become are so complex is that because we have all very strong feelings about that, right? And that strong feelings make a lot of people very uncomfortable. So we'd rather, exactly what you say, Fiona, come up with big policies and big statements and legislate the hell out of it, so we don't have to deal with it, I guess. But so what kind of toolkit do we have in our field to tackle this? What would you think of in that context?
I think the thing that I would say about porn studies, which I really take delight in, is the way that, because we set that journal up and we wanted it to be just kind of open to all sorts of different things that weren't the things that are always reached for when people talk about sex and media. So, you know, in public debates, it's always around protecting children, are women being objectified, sex predators, are people having enough sex or not enough sex, or the right kinds of sex? You know, it's a really narrow set of questions, a really boring set of questions, actually. And that, you know, whatever comes up, it has to be sorted into one of those boxes. And then one of the things that's been a real delight over the last couple of years is in porn studies is that we've had these special issues about last year's South Asian porn studies, East Asian porn studies. We're about to publish a second special issue on South Asian porn studies. And, you know, that's opening up all sorts of different issues and traditions and histories about visual styles that, you know, I had no idea about. The way that different media forms are transferred from cinema into chat forums, different kinds of figures that appear in South Asian porn. Just it's kind of, you know, getting away from this idea that the issue of sex and media is about this, this, and this, and that's all that's interesting. It's like there's so much to know, there's so much to learn, there's so much to find out. It's such a rich area, and it's been kind of invisible. So to me, that's something that purely in an academic sense, rather than kind of engaging with the public, it has been a bit of a revelation, because we were a bit worried. What if there's not much there? You know, when we started the journal in 2014, what if people don't have very much to say about this, or if it's just really repetitive? But it's not. It's such a rich seam, and there's so much to know and find out about. That reveals why these things are important and significant to people in all sorts of different ways, as you say, to different people, in different cultures, in different countries, with all these histories that haven't perhaps been investigated in any real detail. It's totally fascinating. And it you know, just intellectually, that has been squashed out of view in public, I think. It's not, those stories haven't been told, and they're fascinating.
But Belinda, how do you see this? Yeah, please.
Yeah, just as far as the toolkit goes, I mean, I love the transdisciplinarity of the field. I love the fact that there are so many different critical frameworks that we can use, different lenses and ways of seeing sex and sex media and sexuality and identity. And I guess the language too. I mean, while I'm not a huge fan of concepts, well, I should say, well, I'm not a huge fan of labels. So because I think sometimes with such a taxonomy, you can serve to fetishize a particular object. But by the same token, I think it's been really helpful to have a language to be able to talk about whether it's, you know, intersectionality, whether it's being cisgendered. It's wonderful that we have all these terms that we can use and identify with, and I think that really opens up the field, and that is a testament too of its transdisciplinarity. I mean, we have a language to describe layered oppression or compounded marginalization. So it's wonderful that we have that. We're so lucky.
Would you, because that is, I mean, I really appreciate that notion that I mean, and that's one thing I really learned from studying your work in preparation for our conversation today is it's one thing to say like we have to move between binary oppositions and it's something that I guess you can find a lot of different literatures, people making that kind of argument, but it's another thing to then apply that to your own thinking about something that's really personal and private and intimate to you, to stop thinking about male or female or good or bad or masculine and feminine, about I mean, and to just constantly embrace more complexity, more information, more like, okay, this doesn't fit in anywhere.
Yeah.
I love that. Now maybe I'm putting you on the spot, and I don't mean to do that, but I wonder. Maybe if in conclusion we can talk a little bit more about something both of you raised earlier in our conversation, which is the body. And of course, when we're studying sex and media, we are studying bodies doing hopefully fun things. And one thing that has struck me while, I mean, in the last couple of years, I've been working on editing this handbook of media and communication theory, originally written by Dennis McQuail. So this is like this handbook of the entire field of media and mass communication research, both humanities and social sciences. And one thing that struck me in that literature, especially in the last couple of years, of how slowly but surely the body starts to come in. That how media scholarship has for the longest time almost completely ignored the body, and then slowly but surely, I mean, in the humanities, this is exemplified by talking about affect all of a sudden a lot, right? And that started about 5 to 10 years ago, slowly but surely. And of course, talking about affect is talking about bodies. I mean, let's be maybe a bit simplistic, but and in social sciences, you see our communication colleagues beginning to talk about things like embodied cognition, which is again, oh damn, we have to acknowledge the body in the way we make sense of media, the way we act in media, all that kind of stuff. Now, from your position, where talking about the body is where you begin, rather than something you add on at the end, how do you look at this development? I mean, is it something that you feel like, finally people are getting it, or it's more like, well, it's nice that the body is now featuring more in discussions, but it's still, marginalized or, shrouded in all kinds of, like exactly what you say, Belinda, mysterious labels and concepts, rather than just simply talking about, who we are as human beings.
I think there's been, I mean, thinking back to when I sort of started in media studies, all of the questions just seem to be about, how do we decode meaning? There was this kind of very kind of mechanical, there was never, I don't remember ever sort of reading anything or being taught anything about how people might feel about media, so the turn to affect, I think, has been a real game changer. And I've forgotten where I was going with that thought, but I mean, I just really do recognize that it feels like a completely different terrain now, that people do have that starting point to consider how things matter, how they move through us, what it's like to be in a body, how bodies can inhabit media and so on. It feels like we're just in a very different place. But I think, that terms like mediatization and your phrase media life have been really important to that. It's such it marks such a moment from thinking about we are separate from media, and media is like this set of tools out there, to like, well, we live in it, and there isn't this divide. So anyway, I haven't got anything helpful to say about it, but I think
and it doesn't turn us into machines, right? I mean, it actually turns us into even warmer bodies. I love that sentiment, Fiona. Belinda, how do you see this development in the work?
Oh, look, I celebrate this development. I think it's so important. I mean, it goes all the way back to Rene Descartes, doesn't it? Was it Cartesian dualism, that kind of separation of mind and body, and the mind being the rational part, and then the body being kind of the sullied, dirtied aspect of ourselves. And so to transcend the body was seen as being such an ideal state, I suppose. So I think that it's so important to get back to the body, to embrace thinking that involves the body and our lived experiences. And I see that across so many of the disciplines that we engage with as media studies scholars. And it's such a welcome development too. I really believe that, and as Fiona said, with your work, I mean, media life has been so critical.
Yeah, absolutely.
For helping us understand that.
Thanks, but this is not about. I'm not sure, and it would be really embarrassing, but I'm not sure if I read it in your work, Belinda or Fiona, but I when you referenced Descartes, didn't Descartes came up with all of this separation because he got a letter from a princess in Bavaria who and the princess felt in her body, she just was horny. But she thought, like, that's wrong. I shouldn't be feeling this. Can you please help me explain what the hell is going on and how I can remedy this? And then he wrote this catalog of human emotions where you have to separate them and organize them and control them. That's where we get all of this shit from.
Right, okay, that's interesting.
From a horny princess.
Yeah.
Blame a woman. Oh, how original, blame a woman.
And invent a theory to explain what she was feeling away.
Exactly.
Yes.
Oh boy. Yeah. Now we've come full circle. So in conclusion, I would love how can you give us a sense of how your work in this field is moving forward? Like, I mean, maybe something you're working on right now or something you're thinking about doing, like that you are really inspired by at the moment and that we can all look forward to. Now I'm putting you both on the spot. I'm so sorry. I should.
Actually, we're so polite.
I've started working on a book project. It's at a very early stage with two people who are academics but also performers. Well, one's an artist and one's a burlesque performer, and it's going to be called Sex on Stage, and it's all about, well, it's about performance. We want it to be across burlesque, drag, porn, pop culture, so kind of music video type performances. And it's really interesting for me because it's I think one of the things that perhaps porn studies hasn't been good at is developing interesting ways of thinking about pornography as performance, about creative performance, different types of style of performance. Whereas in performance studies and dance studies and those kinds of disciplines, there's much more of a sense of, well, what's going on when somebody creates a persona on stage or holds an audience's attention, or, you know, what are those mechanisms of kind of enchantment and charming and that kind of thing. So, as I say, it's at a very early stage, but I'm finding myself quite challenged because I feel like I haven't really got a lot to bring to the table. And in terms of, well, what can media studies contribute to this set of issues and questions? So that's interesting. But I suppose I'm hoping to learn from that. I think it's something that it is kind of a bit of a gap in our field. So that's something that's kind of inspiring, but also a bit like, oh, beyond my comfort zone.
It sounds amazing. Thanks so much, Fiona. Belinda, are we going to see more work on sex journalism from you, or?
I hope so. I really do. At the moment, I'm interviewing sex doll enthusiasts. And wow. That's just off the back of the research that I did on those, you know, looking at the male homosocial bonds in the doll forum community. And I've actually, what I found really challenging about that particular study was that some of the comments that I was reading, I found them to be quite misogynistic. And so I had to really kind of take off my feminist hat and take a step back and think about the different ways of speaking in those communities. And also with the further research that I did, I found that it was far more complex than what the community was far more complex and diverse than what I had understood it to be. So I guess what I'm doing at the moment is really testing my own critical assumptions about about communities and even where it concerns the sex doll community, and recognizing that there are just like society, there are diverse people within communities, and to not sort of, I guess the assumption is very stereotypical about your sex doll user as being white and middle-aged and very privileged. And I think what that fails to recognise are the class differences and educational differences. And so that's what I'm really trying to investigate further in this project, in interviewing sex doll enthusiasts, trying to find out more about that, about the complexity of their identities and the nature of their connections within that community.
Fabulous. Well, great. So next year we'll meet again and talk some more about these projects. It's been a real privilege seeing both of you and spending this time. Thanks again so much for doing this.
Thank you.
And you know, hey, we're colleagues, so
yeah.
See you in the faculty lounge later on.
See you at the water cooler.
Yeah, exactly.